Welcome to the latest edition of the DBS webinar series, Insurance Insight, designed to give you the tools and information you need as a financial professional. Sit back as we tackle the hottest topics in life insurance, breaking industry news, and leading sales ideas to help you better understand the products and services that will help you help your clients. Now, here's your host, Kurt Fasen, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing.
Well, hello. Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Insurance Insight. I'm again Kurt Fasen, Executive Vice President here at DBS, and today we're going to talk about the November elections. And more importantly, we're going to talk about what financial advisors should take away from this most recent election. We're going to talk about where we are now, what things will affect your clients, and some of the things that you can expect going forward. So to tackle all this, we brought in one of the experts, my guest, Terri Getman. Terri is a longtime experienced financial services professional with over 35 years in business. She is also the Vice President of Advanced Markets here at DBS. Terri, welcome to the program.
Great being here, Kurt, and happy holidays to you and everybody online.
Thank you, Terri. Absolutely. Well, let's get started. General terms about the election, I guess you could call it a Republican trifecta, right?
Absolutely. You might remember in August, Kurt, we were talking and I predicted a trifecta. I just didn't know which party it would be, although it looked more likely from a Republican standpoint, and it certainly came out. Although there were some, I guess, surprises. Certainly the fact that President Trump won the popular vote and every single swing state was certainly a surprise. And it wasn't really a surprise that the Republicans took the Senate. You know, it's now 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats or independents who tend to vote Democratic. And in the House, the vote is unfortunately really close. It is 220 Republicans to 215 Democrats. And of course, President Trump has been picking some of those House members for various positions. So now the spread is actually only 217 to 215. So until there is an election replacing those members that he's appointed to various positions for the next 100 days, which typically the first 100 days of a presidency, we kind of look at to see what's happening. The votes could be very close. So if all the Democrats stay together, which they have a much better tendency at doing than the Republicans doing in the House, you have one defector, and now you've got a thumbs down vote on any Republican initiative in the House. So it's going to be very, very close and very interesting to see the first 100 days of President Trump's presidency.
Yeah, I think it will be, right. And maybe that's an unintended consequence, perhaps, or just a feeling of feeling very, very confident that as President-elect Trump is bringing those people into cabinet positions, that the Republican Party believes they can hold on to those areas. But let's focus on some day one topics, specifically for all of you out there, our advisors that are joining us, and what will likely they'll start hearing about as we move into a Trump presidency.
Yeah, in fact, you've already heard President Trump basically identifying several things. In fact, before day one, we're going to address the war in Ukraine, and I think he's going to look at doing something in Iran. But seriously aside, some of the big issues that we're going to look at are certainly the political appointments. The process that he has to go through that, and we've already started to see a number of his appointments, especially in the cabinet positions. Two, a topic that we haven't heard much about, but certainly is one that needs to get addressed, is that we have a deadline coming up on December 20th with funding the government. Another topic, the debt limit. That's one I've not heard anything about. The suspension of the debt limit will expire on January 2nd. So that's another item that needs to be addressed here fairly shortly. Of course, President Trump's probably number one or number two campaign promise was addressing the immigration crisis. And then finally, we do have a rather large tax bill that's expiring the end of this year. So that is another major item and probably of many of those, the most relevant item for our financial advisors. In addition to the legislative things, we probably should also not forget there's a whole regulatory process. And we have things in the regulatory process that we're waiting to hear what direction we're going in. Most notably, the Department of Labor fiduciary rules, which are currently on hold. We also have some state activities that we're probably going to be looking at, especially in the long-term care space. So bottom line, the first 100 days are going to be really busy.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. Well, all right, so that was a lot of information. Let's back up and go to your first topic, okay? Just the political appointments. So we've read about a few of the nominees, maybe a little bit bumpy, and one has actually decided not to pursue a position. So maybe you should just give us a little bit of background on the appointment process itself.
I do have a slide here that can be brought up. The Constitution basically gives the president the sole authority to make nominations. And that's what's going on now, is we do see that he is making nominations. And for so-called inferior offices, which I guess would be lower offices, those people can go in place. It's the more senior positions that the Constitution goes on to state, but those nominations must receive the consent of the Senate. Now, there are roughly 4,000 political appointments, of which about 1,200 of them are Senate appointments. Now, from our standpoint, certainly there have been some very noted kind of questionable nominees, but one that hasn't been taken much notice by the press, but is probably one that we will be taking notice of, is the Department of Labor Secretary.
Sure.
Probably the most liberal pro-union Republican will be Secretary of the Department of Labor. And of course, that affects things like the PRO Act, your independent contractor rules, as well as potentially the Department of Labor fiduciary rules, depending upon what Texas does on some of the litigation. So certainly we do have to go through a process. So what is that process? Well, the first step, as I said, is the president makes a nomination. It then goes to the Senate. And at the Senate, there are the secretary or the clerk basically shuffles that individual off to the appropriate committee, and the committee then starts investigating that particular nominee. Certainly the nominee had investigation under the nomination process for Trump, but now we go through a second investigation process in the Senate. There's hearings in the various committees for the particular appointee, and that committee has one of three options which it can do. It can, and one of those options is not. They cannot make a recommendation who a nominee should be. They basically can say yes or no, or they can do absolutely nothing. So they can say rule favorably, they can rule unfavorably, or they can do absolutely nothing. Now, in doing nothing, they can either move it forward with no recommendation or just sit on it. And if they sit on it, the Senate can actually move it forward on their own accord. But eventually, once it gets through kind of the appropriate committee, it will go through the Senate floor, where a majority in the Senate can either decide to approve or not approve. If they do approve, the person then goes out back to the president for commissioning, and of course he takes over the particular position that he's been nominated for. Now, in this appointment process, uh, uh, the nomination process in the last 20, 30 years has gotten to be pretty cumbersome for the Senate. I was reading the other day where 70% the approval since 1960, the number of approvals has grown by 70%. And the number of days that is taken to get a nominee approved has grown from 49 to an average of 191 days. And that today, the percentage of the Senate's votes on nomination now exceed the actual votes that they hold on actual legislation.
Wow.
So I'm sitting here thinking, boy, that might be a perfect place for the new Rasmus Fani and Elon Musk to maybe stick their nose in to see if there's some way, that can be rectified. As apparently it was many years ago, they did make some tweaking, but it certainly looks like maybe some more tweaking needs to be done in the appointment process.
It sounds like it, and it sounds to me like if it used to take only just under a month and a half, and now we're up to 191 days. That's a lot of government process and legislation that is just stalled out, that isn't happening during that period of time. So hopefully they can keep that moving at a quick pace. Something I've heard about is something called recess appointments. But I'm not sure I'm really clear on that. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about what a recess appointments are.
Yeah, it's basically a process that maybe is tried to shortchange maybe that long process that the Senate currently goes through in appointing an individual. The recess appointments are a way for potentially a president to get appointed or get in position an individual who may be a little bit more to less of the Senate's liking. So I can think of a few of those right now. Senator Kennedy certainly being one of those as the Secretary of Health is certainly an individual. But basically, what a recess appointment. The Constitution gives the president to be able to appoint an individual to a position when the Senate is not in session. Now, since a 2014 decision that recess must be at least 10 days in length. So even though the process for a Senate recess is anything over 3 days, actually requires the approval of the House. So before the Senate can go on recess of anything longer than 3 days or longer, they have to get approval from the House. And then in order to have a recess appointment, the recess must last at least 10 days. Now, if it does, then President Trump would be able to fill his vacancies. And if a person is appointed to his post during that recess, they can only serve as long as the Senate's next session. So the maximum length would be 2 years, but it likely will be less than 2 years. Now, the Senate does not have to accept the person that was appointed during the recess. But guess what? The individual still gets to hold that post, even if the Senate doesn't like it. He just doesn't, or she just doesn't get paid. So the purse string is still with the Senate. So you can have people appointed during recess. They just will not get paid. And I suspect that maybe a couple of Presidents Trump probably don't need to be too concerned about getting paid. But that is kind of the, how they hold it, hold control. There's also some things called a pro forma session where one senator shows up and sits in the chambers. So that makes them in session. So you can't appoint a person when somebody's actually in chambers. And if you look back, what has happened historically, there's only been 3 cabinet people who've actually been appointed as a recess appointment. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether or not we double that, this with this president, but it tends to be used fairly infrequently over the last 120 years anyway.
Well, so it sounds like an interesting loophole, perhaps, but one that is not used too frequently successfully. All right, I want to move to the next day one topic you brought up, and this is funding the government and the appropriation process. Maybe you could just explain how that process works and really what's happening right now.
Yeah. Well, the Constitution provides that the government doesn't run unless, of course, it is funded. And the purse strings lie with, of course, our Constitution, our Congress. So consequently, every year, Congress must pass a law to fund the government. And it does so in a very structured and a very long process that actually involves passing as many as 12 bills called the appropriation bills. Now, there are two categories of spending by the government. There are some mandatory spending category, which include things like Social Security, Medicare, interest on our debt. Those do not come up on an annual appropriations bill. Those account for, at least as of today, about 72% of the government funding.
Wow.
The other 23%, the discretionary spending, is actually the focus of the appropriation bills. And of that 23%, 50% of it is defense. So it might gives you a little bit of kind of like, okay, this new group of Ramaswamy and Elon Musk objective is to cut $2 trillion of waste. There's not a lot of places that can cut, when you're looking at most of the spending is mandatory, and we have a very small part outside of the defense that is actually an area where, we can see some cuts. We have two excellent appropriation chair. Senator Collins is the Appropriations Committee chairperson in the Senate, and on the House, we have Representative Cole, who's been in that position for quite some time and is really highly well thought of. Within that, there are 12 subcommittees, and the 12 subcommittees then look at each of the 12 areas that they are responsible for, such as agriculture, such as defense, those types of things. The process starts when the president actually makes his proposal, which is the first Monday in February. So President Trump will have on his agenda to make a budget proposal for 2026, starting in February. It then goes to the appropriate committees in the appropriation committees. They hear requests from the various government agencies. They hear requests from various parts of the representatives from around Congress on appropriations. And they finally come up with, after a lot of hearings and a lot of votes, that each of the subcommittees come up with their proposed bill. It then goes to the Appropriation Committee, where they look at the overall bill, and ultimately it goes to the respective floors for vote. Now, when that needs to occur before the end of the fiscal year. Now, the fiscal year for the United States is October 1st to September 31st. So we are already in fiscal year 2025. Unfortunately, we do not have any budget proposals yet, because what happened in September of this year is that the House Republicans decided to put forward a stopgap measure called a continuing resolution to prevent the government from being closed down. But that continuing resolution expires on December 20th. And so even before President Trump takes office, we have the expiration of needing to fund the government. Now, in all likelihoods, we'll probably see another continuing resolution pushing that into 2025. And then we're going to need some voting on how to fund the government for 2025, in addition to, the budget proposal from President Trump for 2026. Now, because of the reconciliation process, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit later, because the limitations on what we have under the reconciliation process, the appropriation bill is likely to be a bipartisan effort. That will mean there will be some give and take on how much money the government will spend under the various agencies. Where we end up in that reconciliation, in that appropriation process, will likely influence, what we see ultimately in the tax bill. So be on the look on, the discussions on the reconciliation, on the appropriation bill. We may see some of the 12 bills. We may see some combining of some of them, such as 3 of the bills that may pass. That's referred to, and I love some of the things that they refer. That's called a minibus, when they have fewer than the entire appropriations. But if they combine all 12 appropriation bills under one piece of legislation, that's usually referred to as omnibus bill. And so that terminology, many of the individuals online have probably heard that as well. So we're at kind of a grind there on the appropriation process on what's going to happen for 2025 as well as potentially 2026.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. And, it's hard to imagine how much goes into putting all the pieces in place to make sure that the funding is appropriate for all the different agencies. And, the money doesn't come from thin air. A lot of it's generated from taxes. And you said, this will influence the tax bill. So we've heard a lot about stuff, or at least I have heard a lot about stuff called the Super Bowl of taxes coming next year. So maybe it'd be a good idea. I'm sure the advisors watching this are going to want to know about the Super Bowl of taxes and what that's really all about.
Yes. Well, as you may recall, back in 2027, we enacted the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, TCJA. And when it was the most significant tax revision since basically Ronald Reagan in 1986. It made significant changes in individual income tax rates. It made changes in the estate tax area, and more specifically and more importantly, the business tax area, which was the primary focus of the legislation at that time. When it was enacted, there were several expirations in it. And the big one that's coming up is the end of December 31st, 2025, when a number of the pieces of legislation will expire. And so therefore, because we have a number of expiring provisions that need to be addressed, it's been dubbed the Super Bowl of taxes. And of course, not to be outdone, President Trump and of course, Vice President Harris also had a number of things that they were proposing during the campaign that are going to also take a role in taxes. So what are some of the things that are going to expire if nothing happens? Well, the first one are your marginal tax rates. All of those will expire, although, an increase from 37% high bracket to 39.6 doesn't sound significant. It's the thresholds at which those rates come into effect, especially those people in the current 22 to 24% tax bracket could see some significant increases. So we have those to look at. Things like the personal exemption was repealed, and the standard deduction in place was doubled. that also will expire. So we will see a reduction of the standard deduction, but a reinstatement of the personal exemption. The capital gains rate, while the rates will remain the same, the threshold of which those rates came into place was increased. So, the 15%, instead of it starting at a certain amount, it started at a higher amount. So therefore, capital gains rates were effectively reduced. That also is going to expire. Itemized deductions. I haven't filed an itemized return since the 2017 Tax Act, thanks to one specific tax provision that got eliminated. Those people, or actually modified, the SALT tax, the state and local taxes that are capped at 10,000. That was part of the modification. The elimination of your miscellaneous itemized deductions, which, by the way, financial advisors, that's where people like me are able to take a deduction for your fees. That was eliminated. So those things would also come back. So there's a number of things from the individual standpoint. Probably the most controversial one, at least for the blue states, is they've been lobbying pretty hard to reinstate the SALT tax, or at least increase the cap. The AMT exemption and threshold also were increased, so that now effectively most people don't have to worry about the alternative minimum tax. Of course, President Trump would like to make that threshold permanent. He'd like to make the marginal brackets permanent. He'd like to make the changes in the itemized deductions permanent, except he would like to see maybe an increase in the cap and the SALT tax. I just was looking at some key statistics. A change in the SALT tax, going back to the way it used to be, allowing for full deduction of the state and local taxes, would cost $1.86 trillion on our deficit over the next 10 years. So it certainly is, an area that we have to kind of watch for. If we're going to increase, we're going to add things back in, then we've got to find revenue someplace. The estate tax deduction, another big item for our industry, was doubled. The exemption was doubled with 2017 Tax Act. That will again sunset. President Trump would like to see that made permanent. And of course, the biggie, as I said, was the corporate rates. They were reduced from 35 to 21%. They were actually made permanent, so we don't have to worry about that change. But President Trump would like to see the rates drop to 15%. So that's again a revenue drag. And to align with that, the big one for most of us, and frankly, most of our clients, we don't tend to work with too many C corporations right now, are there pass-through businesses, the 101, the 199A deduction that allows a pass-through business owners, your partnerships, your LLCs, your FLPs, your S corporations, that allows them to take a 20% deduction off their qualified business income, designed specifically to bring the rate down so that it matches a little bit the corporate tax rate. So we have some parity between those two. That does sunset the end of this year. And so we need to be looking at that. Now, the cost for just extending, not doing anything else, over the next 10 years, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act has been estimated to be at $4.6 trillion. And then we start adding on top of that all the other things that President Trump mentioned during his campaign trail that he would like to add, like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. Kurt, everything I do now is going to be overtime so I can receive tax-free income. So the question then becomes, where do we offset all of this, additional strain on our deficit? We got to raise some revenue. So what are our proposals there? The biggie that President Trump thinks is going to help is we're going to significantly increase our tariffs, to at least 20%. Actually, hit China with a 60% tariff. A lot of people are cautioning President Trump against that move because, we do import a lot of things here in the United States, and that can have, trickle down effect on consumers. He's expecting to reduce our deficit by $2 trillion because of the initiative by Elon Musk with waste and fraud. So that's an item. As you can imagine, he certainly, drill, baby, drill, increase energy and doing some exporting there. And then finally, one of the items that has always been a bullseye for, I think, the Republican Party is to get rid of the Department of Education. More recently, I've heard that another technique that President Trump is looking at doing is forcing all federal employees to go back to work physically, and that he thinks that a number of people will resign or retire if that happens. So lots of things going on there. Certainly the 2017 Tax Act was really intended to push the corporate side. And so I do think, when you start looking at, taking into consideration our current high deficit and the fact that we have a January 2nd timeline in which we have to do something with our debt limit, that's certainly going to be a concern for a number of Republicans. Interesting enough, only 30% of the Republicans who are now in the House actually were around in the 2017 legislation. And in fact, the Republican chairperson of the House Ways and Means Committee really doubts that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would actually have passed in 2017 with the current makeup of the membership. And so a lot of Republicans tend to be, business hawks. So some of the business provisions, are likely to be around, likely to stay. But some of the other provisions, especially if you take a look at President Trump, he won the election with not the billionaires as the Democratic Party has often tried to kind of picture the Republican Party, but by middle class Americans. And so a large number of the people in the House, Republican representatives, are really focused on the middle class tax breaks. And so where does that leave us on the estate tax? Maybe we can see a sunset there, and maybe we'll go back to the $5 million exemption plus inflation to put you at right at about $7 million. So, there's going to be a little heart, discussion. We've got to take a look at the appropriations bill. We've got to look at, all these revenue expenses that we're looking at in the Tax Act. And then we're having to do that at the same time that the debt limit is coming up. And the debt limit is another one of those items that, reconciliation can address. And so we've got a number of things between the appropriation bill, the tax bill, and, the debt limit, all which potentially could be done through a reconciliation process. The expectation right now is when the debt limit hits, when the hits in January 2nd, that we will be using extraordinary measures to continue it, at least get it out past hopefully the time when tax season ends in April.
Right.
Very likely, the first part of the year, we're going to be looking at appropriations. We're going to be looking at appointments. So you're looking at the debt limit and maybe the tax proposals coming in about the same time, about mid-year. I know I've heard discussion that they would like to have a tax bill actually voted on before an August recess. I would love that too, but I'm not, keeping my fingers crossed
Yeah.
because it seems like every time there is a major tax bill, they ruin my Christmas holiday.
Well, there's so much going on, Terry. There is. And, as you think about it, you've got kind of this convergence of these various forces coming together, and it's going to be tricky. It's going to be tricky to see how they navigate that. I think one thing that I've heard you say a few times is the reconciliation process. So maybe it'd be good to just lightly touch on what is the reconciliation process all about. That it plays an important role in what we just talked about.
It absolutely does. A little background on procedures of the House and Senate. The House has a number of mechanisms, and they can pass legislation by a majority vote, and they can cut off debate, with various procedural rules after a reasonable amount of time. The Senate, however, is a little bit more complicated. In the Senate, when a piece of legislation is proposed, they can literally debate it forever. There's you probably, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, that picture. They can also add amendments to that legislation, and those amendments do not even have to be germane to that piece of legislation.
Right.
There is nothing in the Senate that prevents them from doing that. In order to stop that debate and to stop the addition of amendments, they have to be able to invoke closure, and that takes 60 votes in the Senate. Well, Republican Party has 53. So they would need to convince 7 Democrats to invoke closure. And so that's not likely to happen with a tax bill that is likely to be very partisan. It's more likely to happen with an appropriations bill, which can be bipartisan. How about the debt limit? Now, the reconciliation process was established, and yes, it does exist for the House as well as the Senate, but it really has major applications in the Senate. It's a way for the Senate to work. It's a way to cut off, limit the amount of debating that can be done. It's a way to limit the types of amendments that can be added to a piece of legislation. But the reconciliation process is limited to only 3 types of legislation, and that they are legislation that either is going to generate revenue or reduce costs. Often in a tax bill, it's both. And a piece of legislation that addressed the debt ceiling. And so you can only use the reconciliation process in the Senate for 3 times a year. And if you happen to have a piece of tax legislation where you're combining revenue and expenses, that now reduces it down to 1 other time. And so therefore the appropriations process by default is going to have to be bipartisan because we need to address, the debt ceiling. Right. And that's likely to be a very partisan process as well. And so basically it limits the debt, the debate time limits the type of amendments that can be added. So reconciliation cannot, the other part of the reconciliation process that I don't want to miss because a lot of people probably will hear this coming up is the Byrd rule.
Yeah.
That's named after Senator Byrd. Basically the Byrd rule says that you can not increase the deficit over a stated period of time, which is 10 years, and that any piece of amendments added to a revenue, expense, or debt limit must include some type of revenue impact or expense impact. And one of the questions that's been raised is whether or not, because President Trump has a desire to address immigration here, is whether immigrations can be included in that. Likely not. That's probably one of those bird rule things where it would be challenged. Now, I did find, I said, I did love some of the language that the Senate uses, and there must have a little bit of humor there. That when a senator challenges an amendment on the basis of it being kind of extraneous to the overall conversation, it is called a bird dropping. And the entire process of eliminating certain amendments is called a bird bath. So, but certainly, we will see the reconciliation process used in the tax bill. That then only requires 50 votes to allow for the voting of a tax bill and voting of a debt ceiling of 51 votes, the majority, which of course the vice president does vote in the Senate. And so we'll be seeing the only use of the reconciliation for those two processes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's good that it's there, right? So that the process can keep moving. Well, for the advisors that are joining us today, that is a lot of information that covers a lot of the detail behind the scenes in Washington. As our advisors are listening today, I've heard you bring these up, but maybe we should go back to the key financial topics that advisors really should be aware of in this upcoming Trump administration.
Well, it's certainly, the taxes is a big one, especially, the estate taxes and the sunsetting of the exemption. Attorneys are going to be extremely busy this next year on updating estate planning documents, putting in place techniques that can be done today, not knowing what's going to happen in the future. I don't know how many times I've been on the phone with individuals that have extremely high estates, and they're, well, what if the exemption, and I said, well, then buy some term insurance, get yourself so you at least have coverage that can be converted on a guaranteed basis if something goes down. If you're worried about gifting in those, do some loans to trusts, as opposed to, large loans of amounts that can be forgiven at the last minute. There's certainly flexible trust techniques that can be utilized when you've got some desire or concerns about retaining some control. So there's a lot of estate planning techniques. On the business front, the QBI, the 199A deduction is certainly going to be a concern. Well, if we don't see an extension of that, will we see more businesses electing to go C Corp? And, certainly from an insurance perspective, there are things that I like in a C Corp that I can't do as effectively in a pass-through entity for business owners, like deferred comp. I can do a deferred comp in a C Corp for business owners, can't do it really well in an S Corp. So I'd be using, LURP arrangements for them. So those are things that we need to be concerned about. On, on the regulatory front, the Department of Labor, we're going to wait. It's likely, even with the new secretary from Washington State, our very liberal Republican nominee there, they're likely to wait to see what happens in Texas with the decisions there. If those decisions actually vacate the rule, they may go back to square one, starting to redraft a new fiduciary rule. The PRO Act is one that may surface under her, because she was the only Republican to vote in favor of that. Certainly, another couple items from a from a standpoint is the Corporate Transparency Act. An item that I've been telling business owners, well, have you done your filing? The Corporate Transparency Act was designed to prevent money laundering, for small businesses, by requiring small business owners to report, that they are owners. It had to be done by the end of this year, and that was delayed. But I will tell you, CPAs and attorneys more frequently than CPAs. CPAs been staying away from the reporting because there's no E&O protection. So it's been the law firms that have been doing the reporting. They're still moving forward with gathering the information, making sure the client is all ready to report, when and if, that delay opens. So they're still thinking that it's very likely to occur some point in the future. And then now that we're past the election in Washington State, where we now know that the Washington Cares, the long-term care public option there, survived its challenge. We're likely to see more activity at the state standpoint, especially now that most states have gone through their COVID funding. States are looking at their budgets and finding out that they're hurting, and one of the biggest area of expenses for them is the Medicaid partnership that they have with the federal government. And so how do they address, that strain, which is being caused a lot by the long-term care incidents that they're incurring? Interesting enough, there is a federal proposal called the WISH Act that has not seen, has not moved forward, but sounds like it's going to be reinvigorated next year. So we may also see some federal legislation in the area of long-term care as well. So there's a lot of things I think for financial advisors to be watching out for in 2025.
Well, you're so right. And as you're listing those off, I thought to myself, boy, there's a lot to keep track of. Terri, this has been a fascinating discussion, and hopefully all of you out there had a chance to really start to understand the complexities behind putting the government together and funding all of these various pieces and what it'll mean to your clients. We don't have the answers today because we haven't started the Trump administration yet, but be sure to watch us as we continue to analyze and look at what's happening as we head into 2025, and we look for specific strategies that will really help you help your clients in this new political environment. Terri, as always, thank you for joining us. Any final words?
No, Kurt, I think the first 100 days are going to be really exciting to watch. I'm hopeful that maybe we'll have a little bit of reason within Congress, if that's such a thing. And we see some reasonable tax legislation that will help everybody in the economy and our industry as well.
That's perfect. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, when you have advanced markets cases and more complex things that you want to understand how does the current legislation or proposed legislation going to have impact on your clients, make sure you reach out to DBS. We're here to help every step of the way. Until next time, thanks for joining. Be well, take care, be safe, everyone.